So thank you so much, Adam, for joining us. This is Adam Hochschild. He is the author of 11 books. Early in his career, he was a reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle, a commentator on National Public Radio's All Things Considered. He has received the Theodore Roosevelt Woodrow Wilson Award from the American Historical Association. And in 2014, he was elected a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He is a three-time winner of the California Book Awards Gold Medal for Nonfiction. And we thank him so much for coming. In his new book, American Midnight, he writes about what he feels is missing in the typical high school history book. And that is a story of mass imprisonments, torture, vigilante violence, censorship, and even the killings of Black Americans. So Adam, my first question to you, this is your 11th book. Can you tell us where the title came from and why did you write this one and what led you into it?
Well, I have to say my wife suggested the title, and as soon as she did, I thought that's exactly right. And the publisher agreed. I'm not very good at titles. Other people tend to come up with the ones that I use. Why did I write it? For a couple of reasons. I had long been fascinated with the period of the First World War, and I did another book about the First World War, focusing on the British experience in that war, To End All Wars, which was published about a dozen years ago. Um, just because of the sense that that war sort of, as Simon Schama, the historian Simon Schama once said, was the original sin of the 20th century. It did so much to define the world that followed. It's impossible to imagine the Second World War without the first, for example. And in this book, I wanted to look at the experience of the First World War in the United States, because the war, and particularly the war period and the period that followed it, the couple of years thereafter, together really the second term that Woodrow Wilson was in the White House, has long fascinated me because I think this country really went berserk in many ways. And these are the things that I chose to write about in the book. The mass imprisonment of dissenters. It's astounding to me that during those 4 years, 1917 to 21, roughly 1,000 Americans went to prison for a year or more, and a much larger number for shorter periods of time, solely for things that they wrote or said. I don't mean that there wasn't anybody also committing acts of violence or whatever during that time, but these were people who were political prisoners who were imprisoned solely for things that they wrote or said. There was censorship on a large scale. The government essentially shut down some 75 newspapers and magazines in a day when print was the news medium of the day. There was no radio, no TV, no internet. Um, and there was also vigilante violence on a large scale, with the largest vigilante organization, the American Protective League, being sponsored by the Justice Department.
Were you also inspired by firsthand accounts from your father?
Yes, both my parents lived through this period, which will show you how old I am. My father found it particularly difficult because he was the son of a Jewish immigrant from Germany who had married my grandfather, when he was here, the daughter of immigrants. They spoke German at home, but this was a time when you could get beaten up if you were heard speaking German on the street. As soon as the United States entered the war, it unleashed this fanatical super patriotism. Going to war does very strange things to a country. And people with German names began changing them. The Frankfurter became the hot dog. Sauerkraut became Liberty Cabbage. Uh, Hospitals and schools changed their names. Uh, and there was a sort of fanatical super patriotism about this. And my father felt it. He was desperate to get into the army to sort of prove his patriotism. He had bad eyesight that prevented him passing his military physical, but he went to work as a volunteer for the War Department instead. And the effect of this period, the super patriotism of that time, stayed with him and made him absolutely determined to join the army when World War II came along, even though by that time he was 50 years old, and he did.
Oh. So you start the book with a sentence, night had fallen when the squad of detectives appeared on a downtown street. What was it about this particular sentence that made you begin the book this way?
Well, this was a case where there was a raid by local police on a branch of the Wobblies, the industrial workers of the world, the country's most radical labor union in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And it just seemed a striking episode to me that encapsulated the craziness of that time, where there was a tremendous hysteria, not just about the US entering the war and hunting out people who were supposedly pro-German, but also about communism, because the Russian Revolution had happened. People were afraid that the Russian Revolution might spread to the United States, and it created this hysteria. Uh, these guys in the IWW office in Tulsa, Oklahoma, were sitting around reading, playing cards, and so forth. And nonetheless, the police raided the place, arrested them all, shipped them off to jail. They were found guilty of vagrancy. And then, as I describe in that sort of opening scene, um, they were whipped, tarred, and feathered, taken out into the countryside and on a very cold night. And this kind of thing happened all over the country.
Wow. So 1917, 1921, the quote is, there are no ordinary times. Can you tell us what the world was like then and what maybe the US was like during this period?
Well, I think of it this way. Uh, the United States was always portrayed in those high school history books of ours, and I remember mine quite well. Uh, Excuse me 1 second. Somebody's using a chainsaw outside my window, and I just want to shut the window so the noise doesn't disturb us. For 1 second.
I was about to say, I hope people can't see the fly if it's buzzing right in front of my face. It's always something.
Anyway, as I was saying, the history books always tell us, you know, 1914, Europe went to war. The nations of the old world, began tearing each other up and killing their young men by the millions, which was true. But the United States was a country at peace until those dastardly Germans began sinking American ships with their submarines. And so Woodrow Wilson said, we have to go to war and make the world safe for democracy. Well, the story is much more complicated than that. The United States was not a country at peace. There were three enormous struggles going on, each of which had a lot of violence. First was the struggle for rights that Black Americans had been fighting really ever since the Civil War. There were at times in the early 1900s 100 lynchings a year, against Black Americans, mainly but not entirely in the South, who were considered too uppity by their white neighbors. Other kinds of racial violence as well, always with its target against Black Americans. Another struggle was between nativists and immigrants, where the same tensions that are riling the United States today. Uh, there was a lot of fighting about that issue. At that time, the tension was between Americans of Anglo-Saxon stock who were very disturbed at the flood of new immigrants who began coming into this country after the 1880s from Southern and Eastern Europe, which meant Italians, Poles, and Jews. So there was tremendous hysteria about that issue. Several of the major candidates for president of the 1920 elections, both for the Republican and Democratic nominations, were running on platforms of promising mass deportations of immigrants, which sounds all too familiar to us today. The third big struggle that was going on was between business and labor. Uh, Again, with a lot of violence in it, dozens of people killed in labor strife each year. 1913-14 alone, for example, more than 70 people, a lot of them women and children, died in fighting between striking miners and their supporters in Colorado and company police and state militia. So when the US entered the First World War, it was like lighting a match to three, piles of tinder. And it just intensified all of these, uh, you know, tensions that were already rending the society apart.
Well, you just answered my next quote. When the US entered the war in 1917, it was like pouring gasoline on three sets of flames, and it gave the excuse for each one of these conflicts to accelerate. So I think you mentioned all three, which is great, but it was a good quote. So you mentioned some really interesting people in your book, and so I wanted to have you talk a little bit about some of them. The first one is Emma Golden, who she was, where'd she come from, and when did she come to the US?
Well, when I write a book, I always feel like I'm a movie director holding a casting call. Who's going to make it into my cast of characters? Because I believe that to draw readers into a history book, you need to tell the story through people. People like to read about people. I like to read about people, and I like to write about people. So I was looking for people who represented different aspects of this period. Emma Goldman was one of those that I chose. She was an immigrant to this country, like so many people, so many Jews at that time, from Tsarist Russia. She had come here, gosh, I should remember this, but about the age of 18 or 19, lived here most of her life, became very involved in the anarchist movement, uh, also in the feminist movement, was an extremely articulate speaker on such subjects, and she could talk to, an audience of factory workers. She could talk to an audience of middle-class women at a women's club. She could talk to a university audience. She could give speeches in English and Yiddish and German. Uh, and she was very alert to and alive to all the intellectual currents of her day. She'd heard Freud lecture in Vienna. She spoke about Ibsen and modern drama, as well as about anarchism and feminism. The moment the First World War began, she immediately began organizing against the draft because she, like many other Americans, felt that the United States should not join this war. And that provided the pretext for the government to put her in jail for 2 years, which it did. And then soon after she got out, they deported her, shipped her off to Russia with some 250 other radicals the country wanted to get rid of. The mastermind of that whole operation was a 24-year-old Justice Department official named J. Edgar Hoover at the very beginning of a long, long career. And, there are moments that you look for as a historian how to bring things alive. As it happened, just before Goldman was put on that ship that shipped her away from the country forever, she had a conversation with Hoover, an encounter, and we know what they said to each other because there was a member of Congress there to witness it. It happened in the kitchen or galley of a tugboat crossing New York Harbor, where all of these radicals were put on a barge attached to the tugboat, taken to the ship that was to deport them from the country. The government arranged this because it didn't want that ship departing from a wharf for fear that there would be demonstrators protesting the deportation, so they arranged for the ship to be anchored near where the Verrazano Narrows Bridge in New York is today, transported all the deportees there in the middle of the night by tugboat and barge from Ellis Island, where they were being held. The women deportees were in the galley of the tugboat, and there a member of Congress witnessed what J. Edgar Hoover and Emma Goldman said to each other. So that's a conversation that I use in the book. You're always looking, when you write a book, for times when you can record conversations that happen.
Wow. So I didn't know that there were two Americans that were actually buried in Moscow. And you mentioned John Reed and Big Bill Haywood. Can you tell us a little bit about both of those guys?
Yeah, Big Bill Haywood was a leader of the Wobblies, the industrial workers of the world, a very inspirational figure, great orator, had grown up in the far West, been a miner, actually badly injured in an underground mining accident when a pile of rocks collapsed on him. And he was put on trial with a bunch of other Wobblies in Chicago in the middle of this very repressive period. They were all found guilty, sentenced to a cumulative total of more than 800 years of prison time. And as they were going off to prison, Big Bill Haywood wrote to his friend, John Reed, the big match is over, and the other side won because they had cut, shuffle, and deal. Haywood himself had been a saloon card dealer in his youth, so he meant the game was stacked against them. He did get out of prison on bail at one point, but when it became clear to him that he was going to be seized again and jailed for a long term, he fled the country, ended up in Moscow, very unhappy with what he found there. It was not his choice. He would have rather stayed in the United States, but not in prison. And he died there in the late 1920s. John Reed had gone to Russia earlier to, as a journalist, cover the Russian Revolution and Civil War, and was still convinced at the time that he died of typhus, I believe, in 1920, when he was still quite young. He was still convinced that the Soviet Union was paving the way to the future of the world. And he's buried at the Kremlin Wall in Moscow.
Wow. How about Eugene Debs? Interesting character?
Yes, one of my favorites. Debs was really quite a noble figure. He was leader of the American Socialist Party. Before then, a labor activist, leader of the Railway Workers Union. He had been a railway fireman himself, feeding the person who shoveled coal into the engines of coal-powered locomotives. A gentle, noble man who always preached nonviolence, put in jail several times for his labor organizing activities, managed to make friends with his jailers. On one later speaking trip, he actually stopped to have lunch with the sheriff who'd been his jailer when he was locked up for 6 months at one point following a railway strike. When the First World War came along, Debs, like many, many other people on the American left, felt that workers should be fighting the capitalists and not each other, and that therefore the United States should not take part in this war. And he gave a speech urging peace, and that saying that the United States shouldn't join in the war. For that, he was immediately arrested, sent to prison under Woodrow Wilson's administration, sentenced to a 10-year term. And he was in the 1920 presidential election, he was still in prison when he ran for president on the socialist ticket and received almost 1 million votes. The first American to run for president from a prison cell, but maybe not the last. We'll see.
Welcome to current day, right? How
Yeah.
about Albert Sidney Burleson?
Burleson was a very, very conservative Texas congressman who was Woodrow Wilson's postmaster general. And I mentioned that one of the features of this period was censorship, and censorship was quite extreme. And the power to censor publications was given to the Postmaster General because publications, national publications, to reach their readers had to travel through the US mail. As I mentioned, this was pre-radio, pre-TV, pre-internet. You know, if you wanted to get what you wrote into the hands of readers around the country, if you were a newspaper or magazine journalist, it had to be by a newspaper or magazine. Uh, Burleson loved being chief censor, uh, and he essentially used that power to basically shut down some 75 newspapers and magazines around the country and to prevent from being mailed hundreds of individual issues of others as well. It's just remarkable to me that that extreme press censorship does not get a larger space in our history books.
Hmm. Thoughts about Woodrow Wilson? When you were doing your research, have you found some things you didn't know about him? Anything shocked you or anything you disliked when you researched him? And then if you will, talk about the Espionage Act. Did he know about it? Did he support it? And then lastly, how big a surprise when he went to Congress and said that he had to go to war in 1917?
Well, a lot of questions. Woodrow Wilson himself is a very complicated figure. He's not somebody that I loathe unconditionally, uh, in a way I could say about several more recent presidents. A very complicated man because he was both extremely idealistic in many ways on certain issues like child labor, progressive income tax, and so forth. He was a staunch idealist and liberal in the terms of his day. Uh, and, you know, his great dream in life was for the League of Nations. This idea he had that the world would never go to war again if only everybody would, all countries would join this wonderful organization, the League of Nations, sit down around a table and follow agreed upon procedures to talk out their differences instead of going to war. I think the idea would have been, uh, and indeed did turn out to be more disappointing in practice, as had the experience of its successor, the United Nations, since 1945. But nonetheless, Wilson was passionately attached to this idea, and in a way that passionate idealism shortened his life because in 1919, when he was in very ill health, quite weak, he embarked on a very strenuous nationwide speaking tour, promoting the League of Nations, asking people to put pressure on their senators to ratify the peace treaty that contained the League. He did this, as I say, when he was in bad health. Making a speaking tour in those days meant essentially a shouting tour because this was before public address systems. If you wanted to address, you know, 10,000 people in a baseball stadium, you had to shout to be heard. Um, and it was on that journey that Wilson had the first of several major strokes that essentially knocked him out of action for the remaining year and a half of his presidency. So on the one hand, he was somebody with a great deal of idealism. At the same time, he presided over what I think was the most severe repression of civil liberties in the United States, uh, you know, since the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. And we've talked about these things already, you know, the widespread political imprisonments, censorship of the press, vigilante violence. A lot of this happened under the Espionage Act, which was the law that allowed, for example, Postmaster General Burleson to censor the press in the way that he did. It allowed the government to lock up people like Debs when it didn't like something that they said. And Wilson lobbied for the Espionage Act with Congress, actually wanted it to have a tougher press censorship provision than it ended up with. And he knew what was going on. He was not fanatical about the details. And he was focused so totally on his beloved League of Nations, but he knew what was happening. And this repression did happen on his watch, and I think historically he should be held responsible for it.
Do you think that, I know he got the Spanish flu while he was during the Versailles Treaty. Do you think it could have gone different had he not been in such a weakened state from the flu?
I think he might have been a more effective lobbyist for the League of Nations and for the United States to sign the Treaty of Versailles, which contained the League. Could he have been effective enough to get a 2/3 majority in the Senate? I tend to think not, because then, as now, there's a very strong streak of isolationism in the United States, and I don't think 2/3 of the senators would have supported that treaty, even if Wilson had been in the best of health and had been able to use his famous eloquence on them. Wilson was also, although a great orator, was not a very good politician. For example, if he really had wanted to be sure that the Senate would be behind the Versailles Treaty, he should have taken a leading senator or two from both parties to be part of the American peace delegation in Paris. For the first half of 1919, leaders from all over the world gathered in Paris to essentially chart the world to come and make a series of treaties that redrew national boundaries, created countries where they hadn't existed before, and so forth. And had Wilson been a better politician, he would have asked some senators, both Republicans and Democrats, to be part of that process. He didn't. The man had a certain arrogance and just expected that because he felt he was so right about this issue, that he could persuade people to his point of view, which turned out not to be the case.
Do you think Congress was surprised when he asked them to go to war?
No, I think the sentiment, we're turning the clock back a little here to April of 1917. I think the sentiment pushing the United States war had been building, and Wilson himself did some things to push the country in that direction. First of all, let me say that I think it's a fallacy to think that the United States wasn't at war before that point, because it's true we didn't have troops on the ground in Europe, we didn't have battleships firing their guns at sea, but the United States was supplying vast amounts of armaments to the Allied countries. To Britain and France above all, but also to Italy and Russia, who were on the Allied side at that point. Now, theoretically, being a supposedly neutral nation, American business was free to sell its goods to anybody, but they couldn't sell them to Germany and Austria-Hungary because Germany and Austria-Hungary were under a very, very tight British naval blockade, and no ships could get through. So US business made vast amounts of money selling, artillery, submarines, artillery shells, rifles, cartridges, all kinds of war goods, and the raw materials to manufacture more of them to the Allied countries. So in a sense, the US was in the war from the beginning. This naturally upset the Germans, who protested in vain against this. And then finally, in early 1917, declared unrestricted submarine warfare, where they previously had been letting American ships carry these goods to Britain and France without hindrance. Now they declared that any ships sailing into the war zone in Europe, whether they were American or not, would be subject to sinking by German submarines. The Germans quietly behind the scenes approached Wilson, offering to negotiate some exceptions to this, but Wilson rebuffed them, basically because he wanted the United States to go to war. And pro-war sentiment was building in the country, not just because people didn't like to see American ships get sunk, but because, you know, a lot of Americans felt the war that was going on across the Atlantic was reshaping the world to come, and that they wanted to be a part of it. And there were tens of thousands of young Americans who'd gone to Canada to volunteer to join the Canadian Army because Canada had been in it from the beginning as part of the British Commonwealth. There was a famous contingent of American flyers, the Lafayette Escadrille, who formed a volunteer fighter squadron in the French Air Force. And when Wilson finally did go before Congress in April of 1917, everybody knew that he was going to urge it in one way or another to declare war on Germany, and Congress overwhelmingly did.
There's a quote I'd like you to comment on, if you will. World War I was going to remake the world for the worse in every conceivable way.
Well, I think it's pretty indisputable that it did. I mean, consider the world in 1914, before the war began. Even though the war started in Europe, one of the interesting things is that no European country openly claimed the territory of another. That's usually what starts wars. You know, Russia says, hey, you know, Ukraine really belongs to us, and boom, they start a war over it. In 1914, that wasn't the case. Also, they were all trading with each other. Germany was doing a booming trade with Britain, with France, and at a time when monarchies had much more power than they do today, absolute power in Russia and considerable power in Germany, the British, German, and Russian royal families were all closely related to each other, had spent holidays together. And yet, despite those things, Europe went to war, each side convinced that it would be very quick and they would be the winner. None of them really realizing the effect that modern weaponry had. And so what did the war leave us? It left us a world, first of all, where in the fighting itself, some 9 million soldiers had been killed. Depending on how you count them, up to 12 million civilians had been killed. Borders were redrawn. And above all, there was a reservoir of bitterness and resentment left in Germany, which I think made a Second World War absolutely inevitable. And of course, that war was accompanied by the Holocaust as well.
I have one last question before I ask our book club members if they have any questions for you. What do you do when you're not writing a book?
I read a lot of books. I watch movies. I go for walks. I play with my grandchildren. I teach a class at Berkeley. I have a wonderfully privileged life.
Oh, thank you so much. Questions from the audience? Yes.
You want to hand it in? Yes.
We're getting some written questions for you.
We've tried to work out over the years the best alternative to shouting and then repeating
Yes.
when we're doing things on Zoom.
Microphones tend to vibrate in this huge space we're in.
Sure.
Okay, first question. The vigilantes seem to be not only tolerated, but encouraged. How did that get so out of hand?
Well, I think first of all, you have to look at what are the forces impelling people to join vigilante groups? And I think one of the things that was going on in 1914 when well, actually the 1917 really, when the US joined the war, that the groups really got started in a big way, was that there were a lot of men in this country who were a bit beyond military age, felt that the greatest war the world had ever seen was going on. They wanted to be a part of it, but they were too old to, and in some cases, and not good enough health, or too overweight to join the army, but they wanted to be a part of it. And joining a vigilante group, something like the American Protective League that I wrote about in the book, gave them the feeling, the pleasure of being in something paramilitary, and feeling they were somehow protecting the citizenry in this country. Plus, you joined one of these groups, you got to wear a special badge that looked like the kind of badge that a police officer or a firefighter would wear, and it had your rank on it. And people love that kind of thing. Men, at least, love that kind of thing. Women are more sensible and usually aren't attracted to it, but men were by the hundreds of thousands. And of course, these vigilante groups, um, fed into the tensions that were going on in the country at a time. And as those couple of years passed, they became very often groups that took part in suppressing strikes by labor unions.
Why has it taken so long for the evils of the Wilson administration to be widely known?
Well, I think no country likes to look squarely at painful or embarrassing parts of its past. Um, when I was going to high school in the 1950s, we learned a little bit about slavery, but we studied slavery mainly as a cause of the American Civil War. I don't think we read any slave narratives or any material drawn from the slave narratives. But by the time my children went to school in the 1980s, things were different. Why? Because the civil rights movement had happened in the United States and had forced people to pay much more attention to that heritage of slavery, something that's still going on today and is still quite contentious today. Um, and I think there are other parts of our past that we ought to pay equivalent attention to, such as the immense repression that happened during the period that I covered in American Midnight, 1917 to 21. And we don't like to do those things because we like to celebrate our presidents. We like to name things after them. We like to think that, this country is getting better and better all the time and more enlightened all the time. But there are times when, we went in the other direction and we have to look very squarely at that.
If you were teleported to the Oval Office in 1917 with the benefit of hindsight, what do you tell Wilson to do?
I would tell him, think long and hard before you join this war. Yes, the war has been portrayed as a war to punish Germany for invading its neighbors, and it's true in a way that Germany started the war, but think what's going to happen as a result of the war. As I mentioned, the immense reservoir of bitterness and resentment that was left behind in defeated Germany. Think if there's some way you could use the immense power of the United States to force countries to settle their differences peacefully. You could threaten to withhold the export of American munitions to the Allies unless they came to the negotiating table and ended the war by negotiations instead of by pushing for a military victory. Let's think about the alternatives, Woodrow, and I hope you choose one of them. That's what I'd tell him.
The impact of Edith Wilson becoming de facto president in post-war USA.
Well, after Woodrow Wilson had this stroke in the fall of 1919, he still had a year and a half of his presidency to run because he still had the rest of 1919, all of 1920, and the first 3 months of 1921, because in those days the transition to a new administration happened in March following the November presidential election rather than in January, the way it does today. And during that year and a half, the country was basically run by a trio of Wilson's chief of staff, his wife, and his doctor. Nobody really knows to what extent Wilson himself was making any decisions during that time. Because the other three kept portraying themselves as merely carrying out his wishes. But in fact, he never gave a public speech during that period. When he appeared at a cabinet meeting for the first time, some 7 months, I think it was, after he'd had this really severe stroke, cabinet members were struck by the fact that he didn't run the cabinet meeting. He just sat there and listened to them. And he seemed to have to be reminded of who they all were as they entered the room. So he was really not with it. He was a very sick man. And in fact, he died less than 3 years after he left the White House.
Wow. So here's a long question for you. I find political parties confusing during the period you're writing about. For instance, Ollie Hansen and Robert La Follette were Republicans at the same time, even though they seem like opposites. And Leonard Wood and A. Mitchell Palmer were from opposite parties, even though they ran similar campaigns. What did the two parties actually stand for?
Good question. I think the answer is not much of anything because there were tremendously wide differences within each party. And those people that the questioner mentioned exemplify that. Somebody like Robert La Follette, for example, who was the most staunch and outspoken progressive in the United States Senate, was somebody who was definitely at the progressive end of the political spectrum in elective American politics in that era. He was not a socialist, but he was a strong progressive on every single issue. The rights of Black people, the rights of women, the rights of labor. And he was one of 6 United States senators who resisted, who voted against going to war. And he said, look, the president says we're fighting to make the world safe for democracy. Why aren't we demanding freedom for Ireland, for Egypt, for India, who were all colonies of our ally, Great Britain? And for that, he was shunned. He was hanged in effigy on the campus of the University of Wisconsin, his alma mater. And he was from the Republican Party. The Republican Party had a very conservative wing as well. Somebody like Henry Cabot Lodge, senator from Massachusetts, who was a big hawk on the going to war issue and thought Wilson was much too much of a weakling, sort of represented that wing. And similarly, there was a similar range among people in the Democratic Party. It seems screwball to me because you think of political parties as, standing for one thing or another, even if you don't like the thing that they stand for. But there still is something of a range of opinions in American political parties, in each of our 2 major political parties, although by no means as big a range as there was at that time.
Why did Oliver Wendell Holmes change his views about freedom of speech in between, I think it's Schenck and Abrams?
Yeah, that was a very, to me, very moving episode, which I describe in the book. And for those of you who haven't read the book or may not remember it, the legal issue was the constitutionality of the Espionage Act, the act under which so much of this repression took place, the press censorship, the jailing of political dissidents, and so forth. And in early 1919, a case came before the Supreme Court testing that constitutionality, which free speech advocates hoped that the court would use this case to find the law unconstitutional. It involved the jailing of a couple of young members of the Socialist Party for publishing a leaflet in Philadelphia opposing the draft. And their lawyers placed a lot of hope in the figure of Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. and Louis Brandeis, two of the outspoken free speech advocates on the court. To their horror, the court found unanimously that the Espionage Act was constitutional, and to their greater horror, Holmes wrote the decision, and civil libertarians were completely appalled by this. That happened in the spring of 1917. Over the summer, a lot of people worked on Holmes. We know who some of them were. Some of them were people he knew from Harvard Law School. Some of them were colleagues in the judiciary. And that fall, another case came before the Supreme Court, also having to do with the legitimacy of the Espionage Act. This time it involved some leaflets opposing American intervention in the Russian Civil War. Leaflets that had actually been tossed out of a factory window in New York. Leaflets in both English and Yiddish that had landed on the street below. And Holmes, to his enormous credit, changed his mind. And he changed his mind under great pressure because three of his colleagues, we don't know which three, but three other justices of the Supreme Court came to see him in his home when they heard that he was going to oppose the legitimacy of the Espionage Act and said, listen, Oliver, we have to all be together on this. Remember, you fought for the Union in the Civil War. We're all in this together. In fact, Holmes's Civil War sword, he'd been wounded as a Union officer, was on the wall above them. And he said, no, I have now decided the Espionage Act is unconstitutional. We know what they said because his law clerk was listening in from the next room through a half-open door. So Holmes wrote a decision opposing an opinion opposing the legitimacy of the Espionage Act, and Justice Louis Brandeis joined him in that dissent. Supreme Court dissents don't make law, of course, but one of Holmes's biographers says that there's one passage from that dissent which is probably the most quoted passage in English language jurisprudence in defense of free speech. I can't quote it exactly myself, but it's in the book, having to do with the free marketplace and ideas being what democracy is all about. So I think it's always a noble thing when somebody's willing to change his mind for good reasons.
Sure. Before I read the last question, did I miss anyone? Anyone else have any other questions? Okay, we got one more. Okay, coming at you. Thanks, Sue.
Sure.
How do you compare and contrast the treatment of German Americans in World War I with the treatment of Japanese Americans in World War II?
Well, the latter, of course, was much worse because some 100,000 Japanese Americans were locked up in internment camps for a couple of years. It's a lasting disgrace in the history of this country. And I think finally is recognized as such. The furor against German Americans never took that form. It took the form of laws that were passed forbidding speaking German in public, laws that were passed, or not laws that were passed, but simply actions that were made of around the country, literally, there were literally dozens of bonfires of German language books outside schools and libraries that had them. And you can see photos of this on the internet. It's appalling to think that the public encouraged these book burnings. But it didn't take the form of locking people up in internment camps. Perhaps because there were too many German Americans. At that time, there were something like 8 million Americans who claimed some form of German descent. Many of them were just as super patriotic about going to war as everybody else. But there was still a nastiness in the air against them.
So thank you for this book and your other books, especially To End All Wars. What are you working on now and what can we look forward to?
Well, I'm working on a book about the United States in the 1930s, but I think it's going to be a couple of years before it's finished and ready to read. It usually takes me a few years to do each of these books, but that's what my current project is.
Well, I thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure talking with you. I hope we've inspired you with our questions and we'll look forward to hearing from you again, I hope.
Well, I sure hope so. And keep on reading. That's what keeps us writers going.
Take care.
All right.
Yeah, we'll look
Thank
forward
you.
to your next book.
Good. All right. You take care too.